Hi everyone, this is not just a story, it is a reckoning. Before the truth unfolds, before illusions crack and crowns rise, take a moment to show love to this channel by liking, subscribing, and standing with stories where dignity wins and underestimation becomes regret. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where quiet strength always has the final word. The woman at the center of this story learned early how to move through the world without announcing her power. She understood that simplicity could be mistaken for weakness, that calm could be read as compliance, and that silence often made arrogant people feel safe enough to reveal who they truly were. She let them think that was all she was. She let them believe that her modest apartment, her careful budgeting, and her unassuming routines were the full measure of her existence. It made life easier. It made people careless. And carelessness, she knew, was the greatest gift an enemy could give. She met her fiancé in a space that felt neutral, a place where ambition wore friendly smiles and success pretended to be self-made. He admired her at first for her warmth, her steadiness, and her ability to listen without judgment. He liked that she did not compete with him, that she did not challenge his stories of future wealth or nod too quickly at his plans. To him, she seemed impressed by things she had long mastered and grateful for gestures she had outgrown years ago. He mistook her grace for need. What he never questioned was why she never asked him for anything. He did not wonder how she always paid her share on time, how emergencies never seemed to shake her, or why her confidence never flickered even when she spoke of humble beginnings. He filled in the gaps with his own assumptions. He told himself a story where he was the savior, the upgrade, the man lifting a woman from scarcity into comfort. And in that story he was generous, powerful, and indispensable. The laughter came when he thought she could not hear it. It happened in a room that echoed with entitlement, surrounded by people who enjoyed feeling superior to someone not present to defend herself. He joked about her background, about how easy she was to please, about how she would never question him because she had never seen anything better. He reduced her life to a punchline, her discipline to desperation, and her silence to ignorance. In that moment he exposed the shallow foundation of his affection. Respect had never been part of it. She did not cry when she learned what had been said. She did not confront him or collapse into anger. Instead, something settled inside her with quiet certainty. The choice became clear. There would be no argument, no dramatic revelation, no rushed ending. There would only be truth, delivered calmly on her terms, in a setting that could not be denied or explained away. She remembered why she had hidden her reality in the first place. Her upbringing had taught her that visibility attracted parasites, that wealth announced too early invited manipulation, and that the loudest admiration often masked the deepest resentment. She had built a life where her name did not precede her, where her resources remained private, and where her worth was not negotiated in public spaces. The world had not earned full access to her story, and neither had the man who now wore the title of fiancé. The invitation she extended days later was simple, wrapped in normalcy and free of emotion. She suggested a visit, a chance to see where she came from, to understand her roots before the wedding moved forward. He agreed without hesitation, confident that whatever he would see would confirm his assumptions. He imagined something small, something outdated, something that would reinforce his sense of superiority. He looked forward to it not out of curiosity but out of validation. As the day approached, she moved with deliberate calm. She arranged schedules, made quiet calls, and ensured that nothing would be altered for appearances. There would be no staged elegance, no last-minute performances. The home he would see was the home as it always stood, unapologetic, expansive, and grounded in legacy. It was a place that did not need to impress because it had nothing to prove. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The discipline of choosing humility over exposure. The patience required to let people underestimate her without correcting them. The strength it took to love without revealing leverage. She understood that revealing her truth would not just change how he saw her. It would dismantle the narrative he used to define himself. And that, she knew, would be the real shock. On the morning of the visit, she dressed with intention, not extravagance. Her elegance had never been about labels or excess. It lived in posture, in stillness, in the certainty that she belonged in every space she entered. She carried no anger with her, only clarity. This was not revenge driven by spite. This was consequence delivered by reality. As they traveled toward the edge of the city, the landscape shifted. Streets widened. Noise softened. The air itself seemed to slow. He noticed but did not yet understand. His confidence remained intact, buoyed by the belief that he was still in control of the story. He did not see the threshold approaching. He did not recognize that every mile forward was a step deeper into truth. She watched him quietly, not with bitterness but with curiosity. This was the moment where perception would collide with fact. Where laughter born of ignorance would meet the weight of evidence. Where the woman he thought he knew would finally stand in full view, unchanged yet fully revealed. As the gates came into sight, tall and unassuming in their authority, the atmosphere shifted again. The road curved, the world narrowed, and something unspoken pressed into the space between them. He felt no need to explain. Explanation was a privilege he had forfeited when he chose mockery over respect. The car slowed. The entrance waited. And with it, the beginning of an awakening that would reshape everything he thought he understood about power, love, and the woman beside him. The truth was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting to be seen. The gates did not announce themselves with spectacle. They did not shimmer with excess or scream for attention. They stood solid, quiet, and immovable, the kind of presence that did not ask for permission to exist. As the vehicle approached, sensors recognized her arrival before any human intervention was required. The iron parted smoothly, revealing a long private drive framed by ancient trees and manicured land that stretched farther than the eye could comfortably measure. This was not new wealth trying to prove itself. This was legacy settled into the earth, rooted deep. He shifted in his seat as the car moved forward. Confusion crept in first, followed by disbelief. The casual confidence he carried began to thin, though pride kept it from fully cracking. He told himself there had to be a mistake, that perhaps this was a detour or a shared property or a place she worked near. His mind searched desperately for explanations that would preserve his assumptions. None of them held. She remained calm, her expression unchanged, as if this were the most ordinary route in the world. For her it was. She had walked these grounds as a child, learned patience under these trees, and understood responsibility within these walls. This place had shaped her before the world ever tried to define her. It was where she learned that true power did not announce itself. It waited. The house emerged gradually, not rising suddenly but revealing itself layer by layer. Stone, glass, and wood blended in architectural harmony, expansive yet restrained, commanding without arrogance. It did not loom. It grounded. The structure carried the weight of history and intention, designed by people who planned for generations, not impressions. Every line spoke of permanence. He stared now, unable to disguise his reaction. His silence was no longer confident. It was stunned. The laughter he once shared at her expense echoed faintly in his memory, now stripped of humor and replaced with an uncomfortable awareness. The woman he believed he understood was standing beside him, unchanged, yet suddenly incomprehensible. As the car came to a stop, staff moved with quiet efficiency, opening doors, greeting her with familiarity that was neither performative nor distant. There was no surprise in their demeanor. They did not look at her as someone who had arrived. They looked at her as someone who had returned. That distinction mattered more than he could grasp. She stepped out first, her posture relaxed, her presence natural. This was not a reveal staged for drama. It was simply the truth existing in daylight. She did not gesture around her, did not wait for his reaction, did not offer context. The environment spoke fluently on her behalf. Wealth like this did not require explanation. He followed, slower now, his steps uncertain on the gravel path. Every assumption he had built began to collapse under the sheer weight of evidence. The modest apartment, the careful spending, the quiet routines. None of it aligned with what stood before him. He realized too late that he had never asked the right questions. He had been too busy enjoying his imagined superiority. Inside, the home continued its quiet authority. High ceilings carried light effortlessly. Art pieces held stories older than their frames. Every object had purpose not because it was expensive but because it belonged. This was not a house decorated to impress guests. It was a home curated by values, memory, and stewardship. She moved through the space with ease, greeting people who had known her long before she learned restraint in the outside world. Her name carried weight here not because of titles but because of consistency. She had not abandoned this life, she had chosen discretion. She had not escaped her privilege, she had disciplined it. He watched her interact, watched how respect flowed naturally toward her without demand. There was no performance in her authority. No sharp edges. No insecurity. The people around her trusted her, relied on her, and expected her to lead. This was not inherited power wasted. This was responsibility embraced. The realization cut deep. He had not been the provider he imagined himself to be. He had not been the guide, the protector, or the upgrade. He had been the one brought into a world he never qualified to judge. His jokes, his laughter, his casual cruelty, all of it now felt grotesquely small. She still did not confront him. That was the most unsettling part. There was no satisfaction in watching his discomfort. No triumph in his silence. She allowed him the dignity of understanding on his own, even though he had not extended her the same courtesy. That was the difference between them. She did not need to humiliate to feel whole. As they stood in a vast living space overlooking land that stretched beyond fences, the truth finally settled. She had never hidden because she was ashamed. She had hidden because she was wise. She had wanted to be chosen without leverage, loved without intimidation, respected without fear. And he had failed that test without knowing it existed. He saw now how easily he had been exposed. How quickly arrogance had replaced curiosity. How laughter had replaced learning. He understood that even if she spoke now, explained now, forgave now, something irreversible had already occurred. The image he held of himself could not survive this revelation intact. She looked out across the land, not at him. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass, calm, composed, unwavering. This was her world, and she did not need permission to stand in it. She had invited him here not to prove herself but to remove doubt. To let reality speak louder than defense ever could. The air between them grew heavy, not with anger but with consequence. He felt it in the stillness, in the way the house seemed to observe him rather than welcome him. This was not hostility. It was neutrality. And neutrality, he realized, was far more terrifying than judgment. Because judgment could be argued with. Reality could not. She finally turned, her expression steady, her eyes clear. There was no malice there. Only resolve. Whatever came next would not be fueled by revenge but by alignment. She had seen who he was when he thought she was beneath him. Now he would have to decide who he was when standing on ground that reminded him he never was. The visit was far from over. But the illusion already was. The house was more than a structure. It was a living testament to discipline, foresight, and history. Every hallway whispered secrets of generations, each room held quiet victories, and every object bore witness to a life meticulously curated. She guided him through spaces that demanded observation rather than explanation, revealing subtly the depth of her existence without uttering a single word. Every step he took became heavier with comprehension, every glance a reminder that what he assumed was reality was only the surface. He wandered through rooms he had never imagined could exist, and in each the quiet authority of her life made his laughter at her simplicity feel grotesque. A library housed first editions alongside rare manuscripts, the floors beneath his feet polished to perfection but worn where only her footsteps often tread. The walls told stories of triumph, of battles fought behind closed doors, and of resilience so innate it had never needed applause. It was here that he began to understand, she had never been the woman he mocked. She had been a queen, quietly reigning over her own domain while letting fools believe she could be overlooked. He tried to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the reality he could not deny. He had believed she lived simply out of necessity, that the modest apartment was a reflection of limitation, and that her patience was born of circumstance. Now he understood it was the opposite. She had chosen restraint deliberately, allowing only the worthy into her inner world, and only those who could respect her autonomy could ever approach her fully. Her humble beginnings were a veil, not a statement, a protective strategy that had preserved her from opportunists and charlatans alike. As he moved through the grand dining hall, he noticed the subtle indications of legacy. Paintings not just for beauty but for history, silverware not for show but for generations of practice and care, arrangements that spoke of strategic taste rather than ostentation. This was sophistication without arrogance, power without cruelty, and discipline without insecurity. The realization struck him hard. He had been surrounded by a queen the entire time and had laughed at the shadows of her life, blind to the real kingdom she held. She paused before a large window that overlooked the grounds, her profile framed by sunlight streaming through glass. The land stretched beyond what he could see, a blend of cultivated nature and intentional wilderness, each area designed for purpose, each curve and tree a reflection of stewardship. It was not wealth for wealth's sake nor grandeur for admiration. It was control, legacy, and quiet perfection. It was a living lesson in what it meant to be both powerful and restrained, confident yet deliberate. The staff moved around them with synchronized efficiency, familiar not with him but with her presence. There was no tension, no whispering behind backs, only loyalty earned through respect. It was a subtle yet undeniable message. Influence was not commanded here, it was cultivated. She had mastered the art of authority through consistency, patience, and integrity. And he had only ever laughed at the illusion of her poverty. Walking through a hallway lined with ancestral portraits, he noticed how seamlessly history and present coexisted. The weight of generations rested lightly on her shoulders, and she carried it effortlessly. He had never considered that her humble lifestyle was not ignorance but strategy. She had preserved herself while the world assumed she was vulnerable. She had let the careless think themselves superior, letting them expose their own arrogance in the process. It was in the music room that he felt the full measure of her control. Instruments arranged for use, sheet music catalogued with meticulous care, a piano that had been played daily yet maintained flawlessly, everything had a purpose. Every item bore witness to discipline, to attention, to a life fully directed by a woman who refused to compromise her standards. He realized that he had laughed at her thriftiness when it had been the very evidence of her capability, and the irony was suffocating. The truth weighed on him. He had underestimated her at every turn. He had believed charm and pretense could manipulate reality, that mockery could overshadow substance, that superficiality could outshine substance. And in every assumption he had been entirely wrong. She had been several steps ahead, moving with intention, building not just wealth but autonomy, not just comfort but legacy, and she had done it without a hint of resentment or boastfulness. By the time they reached the inner courtyard, with fountains reflecting light and air heavy with the scent of flowers cultivated for decades, he understood the full scope of his failure. This was not a woman to be guided, controlled, or laughed at. She was a sovereign of her world, and his laughter had been the entrance fee he could no longer afford. The reality was simple yet cruel. He had stepped into her life thinking he was a player, and now he realized he was merely an observer in a kingdom he had no right to govern. She stopped in the center of the courtyard, letting the silence speak for her. He noticed for the first time that there was no anger in her eyes, no spite in her posture, only clarity and quiet command. She had chosen this moment not to punish but to reveal. She had not lied, nor had she hidden her worth out of shame. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive at its own pace, and now it had. The arrogance he had worn like armor was useless here. The laughter he had once believed was clever now felt absurdly hollow against the weight of reality. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gardens, yet she remained illuminated by more than light. The aura she carried was not superficial. It was earned, tested, and absolute. Every room, every object, every choice in this house had been part of her silent instruction in patience, strategy, and dignity. And he had ignored it until now, until the walls themselves demanded recognition of her sovereignty. At that moment, standing amidst beauty, order, and quiet power, he understood something profound. This woman had lived her life on her terms, not his assumptions. She had been underestimated by him and many others, but that miscalculation would be remembered. He had laughed at shadows, mocked the surface, and dismissed what he could not see. And now he was faced with a truth too heavy to deny. She was not just a woman, she was a queen. And queens did not forgive carelessness lightly. He tried to speak, but words felt inadequate. Every attempt at conversation stumbled against the quiet authority of the house, against the presence of the woman who had been underestimated for far too long. His voice, once confident, now seemed fragile and small, swallowed by the magnitude of her reality. He had entered this mansion thinking he understood her story, and now he realized he had barely scratched the surface. Every step, every room, every detail revealed a depth he could not have imagined, a world he had no right to presume. She moved through the house as though she were walking through air she alone commanded. It was not arrogance but certainty. Every glance, every gesture, and every silent pause carried intention. She did not rush, she did not apologize, she did not explain. She had already set the stage long ago, carefully constructing a life that could survive mockery, skepticism, and doubt. And now, standing in her domain, he was forced to confront the consequences of his assumptions. In the gallery, walls lined with awards, recognitions, and artifacts that traced the arc of her life, he felt the full weight of what he had mocked. She had built more than wealth, she had built influence, impact, and a legacy that extended far beyond the material. He had laughed at simplicity, but what he had dismissed as frugality was, in fact, a deliberate cultivation of control, discipline, and patience. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of quiet restraint had been part of a plan he could not even begin to comprehend. He began to understand how easily arrogance had blinded him. He had assumed access granted superiority. He had assumed laughter masked judgment. He had assumed ignorance was weakness. Every assumption now lay shattered on the marble floors beneath him, exposed by evidence he could neither dispute nor ignore. The woman he thought he knew had orchestrated a reality so far beyond his imagination that he could feel his confidence crumble with every passing second. In the music room he paused, watching her move her hands across the piano keys, pressing notes she had memorized decades ago, each sound precise, intentional, unyielding. It was not performance, it was mastery. He had imagined he could guide her, teach her, or even surprise her. Yet here she was, showing him that the life she had lived was not random, nor casual, nor naive. It was intentional, disciplined, and executed with a precision that left him speechless. The staff around them moved in quiet synchrony, acknowledging her presence without hesitation. Their respect was not superficial. It was rooted in loyalty earned over years, in trust built from consistent leadership, and in admiration for someone who had quietly proven herself over and over. He realized painfully that he had never earned that respect. He had assumed it would be offered freely, simply because he was present, because he wore the mask of confidence, because he imagined himself indispensable. But here respect could not be bought, demanded, or faked. It had to be earned. In the library, surrounded by volumes that told stories of triumph, strategy, and resilience, he felt the final collapse of his assumptions. Each book, each document, each artifact spoke not of luck or circumstance, but of deliberate, calculated effort. She had moved through life with intention, knowing exactly when to reveal, when to conceal, and when to wait. He had assumed her simplicity meant compliance, but it had meant patience. He had assumed her quiet nature meant weakness, but it had meant strategy. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the expansive grounds, he understood the final truth. He had never seen the full measure of her power. He had never acknowledged it, never appreciated it, and never respected it. The laughter he once shared at her expense now seemed grotesque, a reminder of his own arrogance and short-sightedness. He had entered this home thinking he was superior, and now he was humbled, forced to confront the reality that she had never been beneath him. She had been and always would be beyond him. She stood at the center of the courtyard, calm, composed, and unwavering. She did not need his apology, his recognition, or his validation. He had been given a gift he did not deserve. The chance to see her fully, to confront his own misconceptions, to understand the depth of her sovereignty. And yet, the lesson was harsh, unavoidable, and permanent. He had laughed at a queen, and now he realized he had stepped into her domain completely unprepared. Every assumption, every judgment, every word he had spoken in ignorance had been a step toward this reckoning. He was confronted not by anger, not by malice, but by reality itself. A queen who required nothing, demanded nothing, yet commanded everything by the mere fact of her existence. It was a moment of quiet devastation. Not because she had humiliated him, but because he had finally recognized the cost of underestimating someone capable, disciplined, and wise. The laughter had ended. The assumptions had ended. And now, standing in the halls of her power, he faced a choice: to continue as a man blinded by pride, or to reckon with the truth he could no longer ignore. Every footstep he took from that point forward echoed with the weight of his miscalculation. Every glance he cast upon her world reminded him that he had been wrong. Every moment of silence, every pause in the conversation that did not occur, reinforced the undeniable fact that she had always been the one in control. She had built her life on strategy, patience, and foresight, while he had built his assumptions on arrogance, entitlement, and ignorance. And in this realization he began to feel the first stirrings of genuine humility. He had been given a glimpse of power wielded with grace and restraint, a lesson in sovereignty and a quiet demonstration of consequence. This was not a story of revenge in the traditional sense. There was no drama staged, no confrontation demanded, no public shaming performed. This was a lesson in perception, a reckoning with reality, and an exposure of the dangerous arrogance of underestimation. He had laughed at simplicity, mocked restraint, and judged without knowing. Now he had no choice but to witness the full extent of what he had failed to see. She had offered him entry into her world and he had taken it, unaware of the consequences. The mansion, the legacy, the staff, and the life she had cultivated, all were silent teachers of the cost of ignorance. And as he stood there, overwhelmed, humbled, and unprepared, he realized the ultimate truth. He had never truly known the woman he thought he was about to marry. The sun had set, but the glow of the mansion and its surrounding gardens illuminated the night with understated brilliance. He stood there, a man undone by the truth he could no longer escape, feeling the weight of every misjudgment he had made. The laughter that once seemed harmless now felt like a distant echo of ignorance, a reminder of how completely he had underestimated her. She did not need to speak to convey victory. The reality of her life, her discipline, and her sovereignty had already done it. She guided him through the final rooms of the mansion, each space a continuation of the story she had built over decades. There were no ostentatious displays, no performative gestures, only the natural manifestation of someone who understood the true meaning of wealth, power, and legacy. He followed, subdued, humbled, and increasingly aware of the gap between what he thought he knew and the reality he could not deny. In the gallery of her achievements he could see the arc of a life lived with intention. Awards, letters, and artifacts lined the walls, each one a testament not just to talent, but to perseverance, strategy, and the quiet strength of someone who refused to be underestimated. She had not built her life for the approval of others. She had built it for herself, for her family, and for the legacy she would leave behind. Every detail spoke louder than words ever could. He had come to witness her truth, but in doing so he realized he had been the subject of her subtle mastery. The patience she had shown, the choices she had made to conceal her full power, had all been acts of quiet control. He had laughed, assumed, and mocked without ever recognizing that he was stepping into a carefully curated environment designed to reveal only to the worthy. The lesson was unyielding. Arrogance could never survive in the presence of disciplined sovereignty. She did not chastise him, nor did she demand explanations. That was not her way. She allowed him to feel the full measure of his miscalculations, to understand the disparity between perception and reality, and to confront the consequences of his underestimation. The power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation but through clarity. She had never needed to fight him, she had only needed to exist fully in a world he could not hope to command. As they stepped into the expansive courtyard, the fountains reflecting moonlight, he finally grasped the enormity of what he had dismissed. This was a woman who had walked through life with patience, foresight, and resilience, choosing when to reveal strength and when to conceal it. He had assumed simplicity meant weakness, humility meant naivety, and patience meant compliance. The reality was the exact opposite. She had mastered the art of strategic concealment, and he had been blind to it until now. The weight of recognition pressed on him. Every joke he had made, every laugh shared at her expense, every careless word now seemed like folly. He had been invited into her world under the illusion of familiarity, only to realize he had never truly known her. She had given him access not because he deserved it, but because she was ready to let truth speak louder than assumption. And the truth was undeniable. She was a queen and he had been foolish to imagine otherwise. She finally paused, letting silence fill the space. Her gaze was calm, unwavering, and unyielding. He wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, but he knew no words could undo the weight of his ignorance. This was a reckoning he could not escape, a lesson he could not avoid. She had revealed herself fully, and in doing so she had rewritten the narrative he had constructed around her. He was no longer in control, he had never been in control. The queen had always been sovereign. He realized that his future with her was no longer a given. The foundation of their relationship, built on assumptions and arrogance, had crumbled. If he hoped to remain by her side, it would require humility, respect, and a recognition of her true power. Anything less would be an insult to her sovereignty, a repetition of the mistakes he had already made. The choice was his: to learn, adapt, and rise, or to fall away quietly, leaving her to continue her life unimpeded. As he stood there, humbled and silent, she returned inside, leaving him in the courtyard to absorb the lesson fully. He looked around at the land, the mansion, and the life she had built. Each element reflected purpose, patience, and strategic mastery. He understood finally that he had been invited to witness a kingdom, not to conquer it. He had been shown power not to challenge it but to respect it. The night air carried a sense of finality. He had seen her world in all its truth, and nothing could erase the clarity it had brought. He had underestimated a queen, and now he would never forget the cost of that mistake. In that moment he understood that her power had always been quiet, disciplined, and absolute. She did not need his validation. She did not need his admiration. She needed only to exist fully, and that was enough. The queen had risen long before he thought he saw her. She had been underestimated, mocked, and laughed at, but she had never faltered. Her victory was quiet, unassuming, and undeniable. And he, for all his assumptions, had been forced to witness it. The story had reached its conclusion, but its lesson lingered in the silence. Never underestimate a queen. Never mistake humility for weakness. And never forget that true power often lives in restraint, patience, and the quiet mastery of one's own life. She had invited him to see her world. And in doing so she had reminded him, and anyone who dared to underestimate, that a true queen's dominion cannot be challenged by arrogance, only recognized and respected.